The first thing Lumi noticed was the weight of his gaze. It wasn't the predatory once-over she'd grown accustomed to in rooms like this, the kind that stripped and appraised in a single sweep. It was slower. More deliberate. A man reading a document he wasn't supposed to have. She was standing 3 feet from Julian Croft, her manicured hand resting on his forearm as he gestured expansively toward a rival across the table. Crystal chandeliers caught the edges of the room, wine glasses clinked somewhere in the periphery. The private wine cellar of a billionaire who wanted everyone to know he owned the building, the street, the city block, and possibly the weather. Lumi smiled at something Julian said, some cutting remark about market volatility that wasn't nearly as clever as he thought, and let her gaze drift, just slightly, over his shoulder. Alec Reed stood exactly where he'd been for the last 43 minutes. Same stance. Same unreadable expression. Same crisp black suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent and somehow made him look less like security and more like a specter in a tailored uniform. He was watching her. Not Julian. Not the room. Her. And there was something in his eyes that made her smile falter for the briefest fraction of a second. It wasn't accusation or judgment. It was worse, somehow, he was seeing her. Not the performance. Not the soft laugh at Julian's bad jokes or the way she tilted her head just so, pretending to be fascinated by investment strategies she could dismantle in her sleep. He was seeing the quiet underneath. God, she thought, reaching for her wine glass with a hand that didn't tremble because she trained it not to. This one's dangerous. She'd taken the job 6 weeks ago, on a Tuesday, in a hotel lobby that smelled like money and desperation in equal measure. I need someone who can do 3 things, Julian Croft had said, looking at her over the rim of his espresso cup like she was a line item on a quarterly report. Look good on my arm. Say the right things at the right time. And never, under any circumstances, make me feel like I'm being managed. Lumi had smiled, that particular smile she'd perfected over a decade of dealing with men who thought they were the smartest person in any room. I'll see what I can do, she'd said. But I should warn you, Mr. Croft. The clients who tell me they don't want to be managed are usually the ones who need it most. His laugh had been surprised and genuine, and she'd clocked it as a small victory. Julian Croft was a bully, a narcissist, and a fraud. She'd known that before she'd even Googled him. But he was also wealthy enough to pay her fee, connected enough to open doors she needed opened, and reckless enough to be entertaining. It wasn't the most noble chapter of her career. But crisis management wasn't a noble business. It was triage for reputations, damage control for the powerful, and occasionally, when she was very, very lucky, a chance to nudge the world slightly toward justice. Julian Croft's world needed a lot of nudging. What she hadn't counted on was Alec Reed. He'd been introduced to her as Julian's shadow by one of the junior associates, and Lumi had almost laughed at the description. Shadows didn't observe like that. Shadows didn't make her feel like she just walked into a room with no exits. That first meeting had been brief, handshake, title exchange, nothing more. But Lumi had filed him away with a mental note, watch this one. He sees more than he shows. She'd been right. She just hadn't realized how much he'd already seen. The hell are you looking at, Reed? Julian's voice cut through Lumi's thoughts like a blade. She turned smoothly, her smile already in place, and found her client glowering at his chief of security with the kind of petulant anger that only came from too much power and not enough sleep. Alec's expression didn't shift. Just sweeping the room, sir. Then sweep faster. You're making my date nervous. Julian, Lumi interjected, her voice light and soothing, the verbal equivalent of a gentle hand on the shoulder. He's not making me nervous. I'm just not used to being guarded so well. Most men, you know, they try to protect me from other men. This one seems like he might protect me from myself. She'd meant it as a deflection, a joke to smooth the edges off Julian's temper. But Alec's eyes flicked to hers at the word guarded, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement, quick as a heartbeat, that she'd chosen that word on purpose. Julian laughed, mollified by her attention. "My girl's got a sharp tongue, you hear that, Reed? Sharp enough to draw blood." "Not sharp," Lumi corrected gently, reaching up to adjust Julian's tie with practiced intimacy. "Just direct." She felt Alec's gaze follow the movement of her hands. Felt it settle on the place where her fingers lingered on Julian's collar. Felt it like a physical weight, not jealous, not possessive. Just present. Acknowledging. "Stop looking at me like that," she wanted to say. "You're going to get us both killed." Instead, she smiled at Julian and asked him about the appetizers. The evening progressed in its predictable rhythm, Julian dominating conversations, Julian deflecting criticism, Julian assuming everyone in the room was either a tool or a target. Lumi performed her role with the precision of a concert pianist, hitting every note, the admiring glance, the soft laugh, the way she leaned in when he spoke as if he were saying something genuinely profound. But beneath the performance, she was cataloging. She was always cataloging. The tension between Julian and his rival, Marcus Webb, had been building all night, an undercurrent of old wounds and new betrayals that threatened to surface at any moment. Webb's wife had left him for a venture capitalist with better teeth. Julian had publicly mocked the divorce at a charity gala. Webb had retaliated by poaching one of Julian's key investors. And so it went, the endless spiral of wealthy men wounding each other's pride with the instruments of their own destruction. Lumi didn't care about any of it, except insofar as it affected her job. But she was starting to suspect that Julian's temper was a liability she couldn't manage into submission. When he reached for his wine glass and nearly knocked it over, she was there with a steadying hand. When Webb's wife made a pointed remark about women who settle, Lumi laughed as if she hadn't heard the barb and redirected the conversation to something neutral, a gallery opening, a new restaurant, anything but the live grenade in the room. She was so focused on damage control that she almost missed the subtle shift in the shadows behind Julian's chair. Alec had moved. Not much, just a step closer to the table. A slight adjustment of his weight. But his posture had changed, his shoulders tensed, and his hand was hovering near his jacket pocket in a way that made Lumi's adrenaline spike. She followed his gaze to the far corner of the room, where two men had materialized from somewhere, henchmen, likely, or hired muscle from one of Webb's less reputable associates. They were watching Julian with the intensity of predators sizing up prey. "Shit." Lumi reached for Julian's arm, squeezing once, firmly. "Darling," she said, her voice dropping to something more intimate than she usually allowed herself, "I think we need to have that conversation about the hedge fund. Private. Now." Julian blinked at her, confusion cutting through his aggression. "What conversation? The one we discussed earlier." She held his gaze, letting her eyes flick meaningfully toward the door. "About the paperwork." He wasn't smart, but he wasn't entirely stupid. Something in her expression must have registered, because Julian's irritation subsided into wariness. "Fine. Let's get out of here." He straightened, raising his glass in a mock toast toward Webb. "Marcus, always a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your evening, while you still have an evening to enjoy." It was a stupid taunt, unnecessary and petty, but Lumi was already steering him toward the exit, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a metronome counting down seconds. Alec materialized at Julian's other side, his presence a wall against the room. "Cars at the front, sir." "I don't remember asking you to leave the perimeter," Julian snapped. "You didn't, sir. But I've been doing this long enough to know when a room's gone sour." Lumi felt Julian stiffen beside her, ready to argue, and she smoothed her hand along his arm. "He's right, Julian. Let's just get out of here." I had a terrible feeling about that dessert course anyway. Julian's laugh was short, but it broke the tension. My girl, always thinking about food. Thinking about keeping you out of a fistfight, she corrected gently. Which, I suspect, is significantly more difficult. They made it to the car without incident. The evening had been a near miss, a brush against something dangerous, but Lumi had handled it. She'd handled worse. What she hadn't counted on was Alec's hand on her elbow as Julian made a last trip to the restroom, the briefest and lightest of touches, barely there, and yet somehow more intimate than any of Julian's attentions all night. "Ms. Lumi," he said, and his voice was a low rumble, the first time she'd heard it directed at her. "Don't let him make you stay next time. When I signal, you leave. No hesitation." She turned to face him, and for a moment, she forgot to perform. "You were signaling me? You saw the men in the corner. I saw you see them." His eyes held hers. "You read a room like a card counter reads a deck." It was impressive. "Then why are you telling me to leave?" She was genuinely curious now, the professional mask slipping to reveal something beneath it, a sharp-edged intelligence that she usually kept hidden. "If you know I can handle myself, because you shouldn't have to." He released her elbow, stepping back. "It's not a judgment. It's a recognition." Recognition. The word hung between them like an unspoken promise. Lumi studied him in the low light of the hotel lobby, noticing for the first time the faint scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, the way his eyes held a quietness that didn't match the alertness of his body. She noticed the careful precision of his movements, the economy of his words, the way he just told her something real and dangerous without ever once breaking the protocol of their professional relationship. "Mr. Reed," she said slowly, "you're going to be a problem for me. Only if you let me be, Ms. Lumi. My name is Lumi. Just Lumi." A corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "Lumi. I'll remember that." Julian came back then, reeking of expensive cologne and self-importance, and the moment dissolved like mist. But Lumi felt it lingering, the ghost of something she couldn't quite name, as the car pulled away from the hotel and the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red. She had a feeling she'd just made a mistake she'd never regret. The week that followed was a nightmare. Lumi had known Julian Croft was a liability. She hadn't realized the extent of his recklessness until the news broke: 3 whistleblowers, 15 years of falsified investment reports, and a trail of ruined retirements stretching back to the dot-com crash. The SEC was sniffing around. The media was circling like sharks. And Julian, predictably, was spiraling. "You're supposed to fix this," he screamed at her on a Tuesday afternoon, flinging a glass against the wall of his office. "That's what I pay you for." Lumi didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago that flinching was a luxury she couldn't afford. "I'm aware of what you pay me for, Julian. But I can't fix anything if you keep making it worse." "Making it worse? How am I making it worse?" "By throwing things at walls," she said calmly. "By calling reporters and threatening them. By bringing 4 different women to 4 different events and expecting the press not to notice the pattern. Those are consultants. It's business. You and I both know they're not consultants." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Listen to me. We have a window, maybe 48 hours, to get ahead of this. But I need you to stop acting like a man who has something to hide, and start acting like a man who has nothing to fear. Can you do that?" Julian stared at her, his chest heaving, the rage slowly draining out of him. "Fine," he finally ground out. "Fine. But you're going to that press conference with me. And you're going to smile like you're standing next to a future president." "Julian," she said, and something in her voice made him pause. "I'm going to stand beside you. But I am not going to be your shield. I'm going to be your strategy. There's a difference." He didn't understand. She knew he didn't understand. But he nodded, and that was enough for now. The press conference was scheduled for Thursday. Lumi spent the intervening 2 days in a blur of preparation, briefing sessions, damage assessments, carefully worded statements that she knew wouldn't satisfy anyone but might buy them enough time to find a more permanent solution. She was exhausted, wired on caffeine and adrenaline, and running on the last shreds of her professional composure. The morning of the press conference, everything fell apart. Julian showed up late, hungover, and belligerent. His shirt was rumpled, his tie was crooked, and 20 minutes before he was supposed to face a room full of journalists, he knocked over his coffee and ruined his only clean shirt. "Find me another one," he bellowed at his assistant, who was already frantically scrolling through her phone. "I don't care how, just find one." Lumi stood in the corner of the green room, her arms crossed, watching the chaos unfold. This was the part of her job she hated most, the performance before the performance, the endless management of egos that couldn't manage themselves. But as she watched Julian's assistant nearly weep with frustration, Lumi's eyes flicked to the doorway. Alec stood there, silent as always, his expression neutral. He met her gaze, and something passed between them, a question, an offer. Lumi didn't know why she trusted him. She didn't know why she decided, in that moment, that he was the only person in the room who wouldn't let her down. But she did. She moved toward him, low and quick, her heels barely making a sound on the carpet. "His right-hand drawer," she murmured. "There's a spare shirt. I had it put in when I did the walkthrough last night. Can you get it without causing a scene?" Alec didn't nod. Didn't acknowledge the request. He just turned and walked toward the office door with the same implacable calm he brought to everything. 30 seconds later, he was back. A crisp white shirt, perfectly folded, appeared in his hands like a magician's trick. Lumi took it, her fingers brushing his, and felt something electric travel up her arm. "I need 30 seconds, she said. "He's going to come in here and start yelling again." "Just 30 seconds, Alec confirmed. "I'll handle him." She didn't wait to see how. She just slipped into the hallway, found an empty room, and changed into the shirt as fast as her shaking hands would allow. The fabric smelled faintly of Alec's cologne, wood and something sharp, like cedar after rain. When she returned, Julian was sitting in a chair, calmer, a glass of water in his hand. Alec stood behind him, his presence a subtle anchor. "Better?" Lumi asked, straightening Julian's collar. "Better," Julian mumbled. "Where'd you learn to plan like this?" "Trade secret." She finished adjusting his tie, met Alec's eyes over Julian's shoulder, and saw the briefest flicker of approval in his expression. It was there and gone in an instant, but Lumi felt it like a brand on her skin. The press conference went well. Julian was charming and contrite, a combination that confounded the journalists who'd been expecting a bloodbath. Lumi stood in the wings, watching her strategies play out on a global stage, and felt a flicker of satisfaction. But her mind wasn't on Julian. It was on the man who'd stood in the shadows and helped her save the day, the man who'd known exactly where the spare shirt was without being told, the man who'd seen her at her most frantic and hadn't blinked. After the chaos died down, she found herself in the green room again, alone, staring out the window at the city skyline. The door opened, and she didn't have to turn around to know who it was. "You saw it," she said quietly. "The shirt. You knew it was there." "I know everything that happens in this office," Alec said from somewhere behind her. "It's my job." "I didn't ask you to help me." "No. You asked me to help him." He was closer now, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body behind her. "There's a difference." Lumi turned, and for a moment, she forgot to be the controlled, polished professional she'd spent years crafting. She was just a woman, tired and real and suddenly too aware of the man standing in front of her. "Why do you do it?" she asked. "Why do you stay?" Alec's expression didn't change. "Because it's the job." "It's not just a job. You see things, you see everything. And you never say anything. You never judge. You just watch." She shook her head. "It's exhausting, knowing someone can read you that way." "Then don't try so hard to hide." He said it simply, without condemnation. The people who try the hardest to hide are usually the ones with the most to show. "You're saying I should be less careful?" "I'm saying you don't have to be careful with me." The words landed somewhere deep in Lumi's chest, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She looked up at him, really looked, and saw something she hadn't expected in his eyes. Something soft. Something that looked, against all reason, like hope. "What would I even show you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alec's hand came up, slow enough that she could have stepped away. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers trailing against her cheek with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "Whatever you want," he said. "Whatever you've been keeping quiet." The next few weeks were a slow burn, a low-grade fever that Lumi couldn't seem to shake. She saw Alec everywhere, in the lobby, at events, in the periphery of every meeting she had with Julian. And every time she saw him, something tightened in her chest, a knot of anticipation and dread and something that felt dangerously like wanting. She didn't act on it. She couldn't. Julian was volatile, and any hint of impropriety would get Alec fired, or worse. She kept her distance, kept her eyes averted, kept her thoughts carefully controlled. But control, she was learning, was a fragile thing. The breaking point came at a charity gala, 3 weeks after the press conference. Julian was in a mood, drunk on champagne and his own success, flush with the temporary victory of surviving the scandal. He'd been charming all night, but there was an edge to his charm, a possessiveness that made Lumi's skin crawl. "We did it, my darling," he said, pulling her close in front of a cluster of photographers. "They thought they could take us down, but we proved them wrong." He kissed her cheek, too wet, too familiar, and Lumi felt her smile freeze. But it was what came next that made her blood run cold. "Mr. Croft," one of the reporters called out, "how would you describe your relationship with Miss Lumi? Is she a business associate, or something more?" Julian laughed, loud and ugly. "She's my lucky charm," he said, patting her shoulder like a dog. "My good luck charm. She's the only thing in this town that's worth keeping." The photographers laughed. The reporter smiled. And Lumi felt the walls of her composure crack. She stepped away, a small thing, an inch of distance, but it was enough. She'd never stepped away before. She'd always leaned in, always played the part. "I think," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "you'll find that lucky charms don't have opinions. And I have quite a few, Mr. Croft." It was a dismissal, a deflection. It was also, she realized, a declaration. Julian's eyes narrowed. The people around them sensed the shift, the sudden tension in the air. Alec materialized at the edge of her vision, his presence a silent reassurance. Lumi smiled, that perfect, practiced smile, and excused herself to the restroom. But on the way, she let her eyes meet Alec's. Just for a moment. Just long enough to say, "I'm okay. I promise." She wasn't okay. She was falling, and she couldn't stop. The ride home was a nightmare. Julian had drunk more than she'd realized, and he was in a possessive mood, his hand on her thigh the entire way, his breath sour against her neck. Lumi sat rigidly, her smile fixed, counting the seconds until she could escape. When the car pulled up to her apartment, Julian made a move to follow her. "You know," he slurred, "I've never seen your place. You should invite me up." "Julian, you're exhausted," Lumi said, keeping her voice soothing. "You need rest. I need to see where my girl lives." His hand closed around her wrist, and Lumi felt the first frisson of genuine fear. "Just a drink. Then I'll leave." It was Alec who intervened. "Mr. Croft." His voice was calm and professional, nothing in it to indicate the tension Lumi could feel radiating from him. "You have a conference call at 7 tomorrow. I strongly recommend you get a full night's sleep. Reed, I swear to God, she'll be safe." Alec said it quietly, but something in the words made Julian pause. "You trusted me with her safety, and I haven't failed you yet, have I?" The logic was faulty. Alec had never been assigned to protect Lumi, not officially, but Julian was too drunk to parse the distinction. He grumbled, but let her go, stumbling back into the car as the driver pulled away. Lumi stood on the sidewalk, her heart pounding, watching the taillights disappear. Then she turned and looked at Alec, standing in the pool of light from the street lamp, his expression hooded and unreadable. "Thank you," she said. "Again. Don't thank me." He was looking at her with something she couldn't name. He shouldn't have done that. He shouldn't. He stopped, his jaw tight. Lumi reached into her bag and pulled out her keys. She held them for a moment, weighing the risk, and then she pressed them into his palm. "Not for standing guard," she said, her voice low and steady despite the pounding in her chest. "Just so you know, if you ever need a place, a cup of tea, a book to read, shelter from the rain, there's a door here. If you want it." Alec stared down at the keys in his hand. "Lumi, I'm not asking you to protect me," she said. I'm telling you there's a choice. That's all." She turned and walked toward her building before she could see his face, before the fear and the hope and the unbearable fragility of the moment could overwhelm her. She was almost at the door when she heard him say her name. "Lumi." She stopped. "I'll be on the street corner," he said. "For the next 45 minutes. Just in case." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and let herself into the building. The next morning, Julian Croft discovered the security footage. Lumi didn't know how he'd gotten it, some favor from a corrupt tech, probably, or leverage over an employee who owed him, but he had it. The footage of her standing on the sidewalk, the keys in Alec's hand, the prolonged look between them that could only mean one thing. He summoned them both to his office. "You're fired," he said to Alec, without preamble. "Pack your things and get out." "Julian," Lumi said, her voice sharp, "you can't just shut up." Julian's face was red with fury. "Shut up or I'll make your life a living hell. You think you're good at your job? I'll make sure no one in this city hires you again. I'll make sure everyone knows you're just a..." "I'm not," Lumi said quietly. "I'm not just anything. You knew that when you hired me." Julian laughed, but it was a broken thing. "Get out. Both of you. You're nothing. You're worse than nothing. You're traitors." "I'm not a traitor." Lumi straightened, her spine steel. "I never belonged to you, Julian. You bought my time, not my loyalty. There's a difference." She turned to Alec, who had been standing silent through the entire exchange. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the coiled readiness of a man who'd faced worse than an angry employer. 45 minutes, she said to him. That was about 78 hours ago. You might have missed your window. The window's still open. His voice was calm, steady. I know exactly where the keys are. Julian made a sound of inarticulate rage, and Lumi felt a sudden, sharp freedom. I don't want to be your lucky charm, she said to him. I've never been that. And if I were, I'd be a pretty terrible one, since I'm about to walk out that door and leave you to your own consequences. She walked toward Alec. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. In the hallway, away from Julian's screaming, she felt the fight drain out of her. I need a night, she said. A night where no one can find me. A night with someone who sees me. Alec reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I see you, he said. I've always seen you. They drove for hours, out of the city, past the suburbs, into a darkness that deepened until the only lights were the headlights cutting through the wet night. Rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, a drumbeat against the windshield that filled the silence without drowning it. Lumi leaned her head against the passenger window, watching the rain streak the glass, and felt something unwind in her chest. Where are we going? She asked. I don't know, Alex said honestly. I just kept driving west. That's as good a plan as any. They drove in silence for a while, the rhythm of the rain and the road a meditation. Lumi watched his profile in the dim light of the dashboard, the sharp jaw, the scars she'd noticed the first night, the careful way he handled the wheel as if he were handling something precious. Why did you take the keys? She asked finally. Alec was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough. Because you gave them to me without asking for anything in return. You gave me a choice. That's more than anyone's ever given me. Lumi's throat tightened. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. I don't know how to be anything but controlled. Then don't be. He glanced at her, and for the first time, she saw something unguarded in his eyes. Don't do anything you're not ready for. I'll be here either way. She looked at him for a long moment, then did something she hadn't expected to do. She reached out and turned the radio off. Stop the car, she said. Alec pulled over to the shoulder of the road, the tires crunching on gravel. The rain was a curtain around them, sealing them into a private world of steam and silence. Lumi turned to face him. I've spent so long being the person other people need me to be, she said. I've managed, I've fixed, I've controlled. But with you, I don't have to do any of that. With you, I just have to be seen. Alec's hand came up, cooping her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. You're the bravest woman I've ever met, he said. The smartest. The kindest. And the most terrifyingly beautiful. Terrifying? Because I've never wanted anything the way I want this. He leaned closer, his forehead touching hers. And I've never been afraid of something I wanted before. Lumi closed the distance. Their lips met, soft and tentative at first, then deepening as the months of careful distance collapsed into something urgent and real. Alec's hand tangled in her hair, and she felt the tension of years of control sliding away, dissolving into the warmth of his mouth, the strength of his arms around her. She pulled back, breathless, and laughed, a real laugh, surprised and unguarded. I don't even know your middle name. It's James. James. She tasted it on her tongue. I like that. Alec smiled, and she realized she'd never seen him smile before. It changed his whole face, softened the edges, made him look younger and more hopeful than she'd imagined. We should go, he said reluctantly. Before the rain gets worse. Where to? I don't know. Wherever you want. Lumi looked out at the rain and thought about her apartment, the book open on her desk, the life she'd been living before this moment. But when she looked back at Alec, with his careful hands and his warm eyes and his steady, patient presence, she knew that whatever came next, she wouldn't be facing it alone. "Take me home," she said. "But not the one I left. The one I'm building now." He kissed her forehead, soft and tender. "That's the only direction I know how to drive." They pulled back onto the road, the headlights cutting through the rain, and Lumi reached for his hand across the console. Their fingers interlaced, and she felt something click into place inside her. She was still the woman who could read a room and control a situation, the crisis manager, the smooth talker, the one who showed up just when she was needed. But she was also something more now, something chosen, something seen. Alex squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back. The rain would stop eventually. The trouble would find them, maybe, or maybe it wouldn't. But for now, there was the road, and the warmth of his palm, and the quiet certainty that she'd found exactly what she hadn't known she was looking for. "I was right, you know," she said as the city lights appeared on the horizon. "That first night. I said you'd be a problem for me. And? I was wrong. You weren't the problem at all." She smiled at him in the darkness. "You were the answer."
Subscribe to me for more content.